The following program is a production of the Fairfax Network, Fairfax County Public Schools.
This program was made possible through generous support of the Donald W. Reynolds Foundation to George Washington's Mount Vernon Estate Museum and Gardens. Inaugural Visions, Presidents Washington to Obama, is a co-production of the Fairfax Network and George Washington's Mount Vernon Estate Museum and Gardens.
The preservation of the sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of the Republican model of government are justly considered, perhaps, as deeply, as finally staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people.
With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
The orderly transfer of authority as called for in the Constitution routinely takes place as it has for almost 2 centuries, and few of us stop to think how unique we really are. This every 4-year ceremony we accept as normal is nothing less than a miracle.
Let it be said by our children's children that when we were tested, we refused to let this journey end, that we did not turn back nor did we falter. And with eyes fixed on the horizon and God's grace upon us, we carried forth that great gift of freedom and delivered it safely to future generations.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's gathering. We're going to talk about President Obama and George Washington. I'm really excited to be here with all of you. My name is Jennifer Nedeau, and I do a lot of different things, but I've worked in media for Time Magazine, and I currently do digital strategy for nonprofits and campaigns. And I have some very smart gentlemen on stage with me who are going to discuss some of the amazing tradition we have with the inauguration. Here we have Professor Stephen Farnsworth, who is a professor and director at the Center for Leadership and Media Studies at the University of Mary. And we have Peter Henriques, who is a professor of history from George Mason University. I'll let them say a few more words about themselves so you can know their rich expertise, and then we'll dive into some questions to kick things off. And then I'm going to be looking at some tweets and emails from students. Some of you guys gave us great questions in advance, but if you have questions during this discussion, you can use the hashtag GWLeadership to submit them. I know that, technology today is something that, thrives, and it's not something that's been around forever. But I really hope that you guys can join this discussion, and that's really much why I'm here, to make this an interactive multimedia experience. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Okay, well, I want to keep the introduction really brief so that we have lots of time for questions. I teach at the University of Mary Washington. I teach courses in the media and the presidency, and I've written several books that deal particularly with the presidency and the media. I'm really interested in the intersection of politics and news and how news is changing. So those would be the kinds of things that I'd be really interested in talking with you guys about today.
And I'm Peter Henriques. I'm a retired history professor from George Mason. Often speak here at Mount Vernon, and my most recent book is Realistic Visionary, a Portrait of George Washington.
Okay, that's great. So why don't we kick things off? I mean, we had a historic election in 2008. We elected the first African-American president, and then we have George Washington, who was the first president ever. So we're really looking at 2 really powerful events side by side today, and I'm really excited to have you both here. But why are we doing this again this weekend? Why is there a second inauguration?
Well, the truth is that in America, there's a lot that divides us as a country, as a people. And if you look at the history of American politics, you see that a lot of these elections have been very close. And a lot of the disagreements, political disagreements, have been really profound on a lot of major issues. And what the inauguration is, I think above all, is a chance for people to come together and to be Americans together. Just even if it's for a few hours, we are one people for that moment. And even though the second inauguration. A second-term inauguration isn't as big, it isn't as dramatic, and it's not going to perhaps be as emotional as a first-term inauguration, particularly for Barack Obama. The truth is that it's a moment of reinvigoration. When a president starts a second term, they're looking at new personalities in terms of their cabinet. They're in a very different political position, so they can think more about their long-term legacy. They don't have to worry about being reelected, and that can dramatically change the sorts of things they emphasize in their presidencies.
Thank you. And why did we have the first inauguration? What did that mean for George Washington?
Well, Washington, of course, was unanimously elected president. He's the only person to have done that. And really, his procession from Mount Vernon up to New York, which was the first capital, it's a little bit almost like a royal progress from the king on the way to London. He was feted and greeted and honored and praised all the way from here until he got to New York. And there, under the new Constitution, there was a specific oath that he needed to take, and this was a very exciting beginning of the new country, and it was a very dramatic moment. It did have the excitement of large crowds trying to get a glimpse of this remarkable American hero to start this experiment in American republicanism.
Now, Peter, you said, we talked earlier this week that Washington defined the office, but Washington doesn't define the man. I might be muddling your words a little bit, but can you talk about the difference between how George Washington was elected compared with Obama and what that means today?
Well, I guess there are two questions. I mean, you've got to remember at the beginning, this was a very new system. Washington really gave prestige to the presidency. Today, it's the presidency that gives prestige to Obama or anybody who holds that office. Washington was, as I said, unanimously elected. They came up with this very strange system that we still generally follow, the establishment of an electoral college, and where the electors were chosen either by popular elections or by the state legislatures. The Continental Congress said that all the states should pick their electors on the 7th of January of 1789. They would get together in February in the different states, not knowing what the other states did, open the ballots, but there really was no question in anyone's mind that George Washington would be the president, any more than who would be the president of South Africa after the end of apartheid than Nelson Mandela, the man who achieved the end of apartheid without violence. Washington is the unique American hero who had won our freedom. He has a special appeal to the American people that, frankly, has never been matched, and I can't envision ever being matched in the future.
Okay. Do you agree with him there? Do you think that the prestige, that Washington brought that to the presidency and now every president seeks it themselves, or is that still something that, that allure? I mean, I think President Obama has a unique presidency in a lot of ways.
Well, of course, every president is facing a unique set of circumstances and a unique set of challenges. And so it's really hard, those of us who try to study the presidency, to really make a lot of comparisons, because we don't know how George Washington would have handled the Cold War. We don't know how Abraham Lincoln would have dealt with the breakup of the Soviet Union. There are so many things that we have to appreciate about the uniqueness of each presidential time and each presidential place. But if you can say that something is more unique, I don't think you should write it in your term papers, because a lot of professors would have a problem with that construction. But it's important to appreciate that the situation that Washington faced was the most important of all, because when you look at the Constitution itself, when you read what the founders came up with for the office of the presidency, there was a great deal of gray area that wasn't all that well defined. And so much of what the presidency became was when Washington went into the office and defined it by doing it. And so every president since George Washington has been president in many ways in Washington's shadow. And it really is an environment where the modern American president is linked to the original American president in a profound way in terms of how one deals with Congress, in terms of how one connects to the public in the society as a whole. And so while the electorates are very different and the political environment is incredibly changed from one president to the other, there is this common thread that goes throughout American history, and it is the office that not only was written into the Constitution, but at least as much how it was defined by Washington and his 8 years in office.
I'd like to add something to that, Steve,
okay,
in terms of when you look at the presidency, it's a surprisingly potentially strong office. The original Constitution has the president can serve an unlimited number of 4-year terms. He's commander-in-chief of the Army. He has veto power. He has significant appointment powers. He has the ability of pardons and things along that line, and a great deal of flexibility in foreign affairs. And you wouldn't expect, since we had been burned by Great Britain and strong executive power, that we would give so much power to this brand new office of the presidency. And the reason they felt comfortable, they were really gained, I guess, more by their hopes than their fears. Washington, they knew, would be the first president. He had not abused power. He had given it up after the end of the American Revolution. So they knew he would shape the office, and they could trust him with power. So actually, Washington does a lot to shape the office of the presidency even before he becomes President of the United States. And then, of course, as president, makes so many key decisions that future presidents have followed in his footsteps.
Well, I think that's a great primer for, what we're about to witness this weekend. Can you talk a little bit about, and this is from an email from someone from Bricks Township in New Jersey who decided to send us this question. What are the main differences between the first inaugural address of George Washington and the second address that President Obama will be delivering this weekend?
Well, to me, the main difference is the reach. When you think about the modern media environment and the ability of any president to reach not only the people across this wide country, but across the world, you really have a moment where everyone is paying attention. This is an extraordinarily big event compared to the media of George Washington's time. I mean, when you talk about how...
they didn't have Facebook and Twitter to talk about it then?
Yeah, there wasn't any sort of hashtag for inauguration #1. And that reality is that is really, I think, an important part of the role that the presidency has today, because, I think that in many ways, presidents are national fathers, not unlike George Washington, but their ability to reach ordinary Americans and to be the center of the national conversation about where the country is going, where the society needs to go. It's really extraordinary. I mean, the big difference to me is this media environment where you can go anywhere in the world, and at any time you can find all the information that you need online. And that gives us the opportunity to watch some of the old presidents, the presidential inaugural addresses from before we were born. But it also gives us the opportunity to see and connect and interact, of course, because, of course, the big issue trending on Twitter this weekend is going to be inauguration #2 for Barack Obama. And George Washington didn't get that kind of attention. He had a lot of respect, but he didn't have a hashtag.
That's true. But I like to say, Paul Revere was maybe the first tweeter. He ran around saying the British are coming, which is fits into 140 characters. And I think of how technology has changed and how it's evolved, and really the way we communicate today is in brief, memorable statements. And I think that from the telegram to Twitter, we can see that there's still some consistency in terms of the power of communication and the power of the president being able to talk to people either at a one-to-one level or on a stage.
And Washington's inaugural address was heard, probably those of you in the back of the room would not be able to hear it. Washington was not much of a public speaker. He was fairly nervous in presenting public oratory. And his speech was carefully crafted. James Madison helped write it. Believe it or not, one of his early aides wrote a 73-page inaugural address, which fortunately Washington talked to Madison and they changed it down to about 4 pages, and had some very significant quotes in it. But the main thing was not so much what Washington said, but the fact that he took the oath of office and began this new experiment as president. That was really the key event. And once he was finished taking the oath, just in terms of a slight controversy, Washington, unlike when Obama finishes his oath, he will add extra words to what the Constitution says. Obama will say, "So help me God." Myth to the contrary, Washington did not say that at the end of his inaugural address. He followed just what was in the Constitution.
Okay, I mean, just remember, you can't type out 73 pages. No one had laptops back then. So that sounds like quite a lot of editing work for anyone who's had to edit a paper or write something quite long. I'm going to take the next question from Twitter. Peace Love Bubs, I might be saying that wrong, asks us, how would Obama's agenda be different if he had as little media coverage as George Washington? I think that's a really interesting question, having worked in the media myself and realizing the power of that platform. You know, what did he have to care what the press thought, or, you know, I mean, what do you think? Would President Obama have a different agenda today?
Well, it's really hard to imagine, I think, the political environment, those of us who've come up with the media as in its current form or have seen it develop in recent years, to imagine how different it was, because in many ways the historical reality of the American political system involved a much more isolated lawmaking than we see today. Not only do we have presidents not being able to command the national discourse the same way, you had fewer people listening, and government was much smaller. This was also affecting members of Congress. And so I think that one of the big things that the early presidents had to deal with that modern presidents may not be particularly as good at is just negotiating with these individual people who are somewhat removed from their constituencies. They did not face the immediate wrath of the National Rifle Association if they talk about changing gun control laws. And so the situation that in many ways you may think of as a presidential advantage, the presence of this ubiquitous mass media that allows the president to be on CNN and C-SPAN and Facebook and Twitter all the time, is a great advantage for a president. It's also a great disadvantage because it's much harder to move members of Congress when everybody is watching members of Congress really closely. And so you really do have a very difficult modern environment when you think about trying to legislate. I tend to think that probably what you would see would be an even more aggressive agenda from Obama without this kind of media in response to the question, because you wouldn't have to worry as much about the destructive efforts against the president's agenda by very well-organized, well-mediated voices. You wouldn't have to worry about the very close, up-to-the-second monitoring of individual lawmakers who are much more worried about primary opponents and interest groups working against them than they are interested in working with the president, particularly across party lines. And so I think that that environment might be constraining to a president, not necessarily ennobling or expanding with media.
If you think of the difference in terms of the age, when you think of now, remember Washington is unanimously elected by, I come back to that point because he owes nothing to anyone. He's universally beloved as he comes into the office. Today we have a situation where we've got unembarrassed partisanship, we have embedded lobbyists, we have a media circus, we have this kind of constant barrage and tension, and that's a very different atmosphere to operate on.
I mean, I don't know who saw Lincoln in the room. Did anyone see it? They seem like they had some pretty fierce discussions, you know, in Congress back in the day. So are you trying to say that, you know, yes, Congress is more partisan, but in some ways they might be more scripted? I mean, it seems like without the media attention, you may have been able to be more forthright.
No, there's no question. Partisan, I mean, if you look at the 1790s, although not right when Washington's inaugurated, but partisanship is a major issue. The division between Hamilton and Jefferson, the Republican and Federalist parties, every bit as bitter as Tea Party views of Obama today. There's a great deal of friction. So it is not that, but it is a different atmosphere, and really Washington's approach is almost really a pre-democratic approach to the presidency. His view of a republic is that the leader stays above partisan bickering, short-term Gallup poll types of things, and does what is in the best interest of the country. But really, in this modern age, Washington's approach, to be honest with you, probably would not be successful, and he wouldn't be elected, and to be honest with you, he wouldn't run in this kind of system.
Well, that's something to think about as we're up here today at Mount Vernon. The next question we have comes from Bailey Bishop 2 on Twitter, and he has to say, why does the president have to be re-inaugurated when they're elected for a second term? Why do we do it twice?
Well, for me, I think the biggest thing is the point that I made before about how people really need to come together, at least briefly, because we don't have a lot of institutions that bring us together as a people. Most of politics is about driving people apart. Which team are you on? Which side are you on? How do you feel about this issue? Who is donating to your campaigns, and those sorts of things. But also, presidents who have been reelected, and now they know, of course, they can never run again, they often have a very different agenda in a second term than a first term. I think that one of the big things that that explains the emphasis on gun control that you've seen in recent weeks from the Obama administration is very clearly the tragedy in Connecticut, but also the practical political reality that he does not have to face the voters again, and he doesn't have to worry as much about making enemies as he might the first time. And so in many ways, I think a second term allows for this vision, the original vision of Washington's first term, where you are sort of above politics, at least to an extent. I mean, no president can ever be truly above politics. They have to convince members of Congress who are very political to go along with them if they're going to get very far. But the reality is they think much more about the legacy. They think much more about the long-term interests of how they want to be remembered and what they want to do, and that can really create a very different agenda. And so I do think it's really important to hear a second-term inaugural address. Most of them are not very famous, of course. Most presidents give a better first-term address than a second term. But the truth of the matter is that there is often a redirection, and it's important for us all to know exactly what shape that new administration is going to take in a second term.
And the inauguration, I mean, you're elected for a set period of time under the Constitution. So if you're elected a second time, you need to renew your oath under the Constitution to continue it. Washington didn't really talk about second-term inaugural addresses. I'm sure this is one record Obama will not beat. Washington's second inaugural address was 135 words long. It was just pew, done. Here we are, done, let's move on. So he did not, but he certainly saw the need to renew his oath under the Constitution.
I think that would fit in a Facebook update. What do you guys think? I mean, one of the things I wanted to ask, though, is, you said this point about tradition, and I believe that, too. I mean, we came through such a bitter year of a campaign, and there were so many doubts cast on the president, even during his first term. The whole birth certificate situation was fairly ridiculous from my point of view. It seems like this president, even more than others, has to reaffirm his credibility over and over again. So what are some of the traditions that he'll be, proceeding with? And this is based on a question from Twitter as well, from Sophia Crutch. How has the ceremonial aspect of the inauguration evolved and or stayed the same over time? I don't know who wants to start.
Well, the first Washington was not clear. I mean, he came from down the road in a carriage protected by military people, came into where the Senate and the House, it's where on Wall Street, the old federal building, you could see where Washington was inaugurated. They had to scurry around to find a Bible for him to take the oath upon. And then it was delivered on a balcony in front of a large crowd that couldn't hear anything, but they could see their hero. The ceremony itself was very brief because the constitutional oath is very brief and written right into the Constitution. And then when it was done and the Chancellor Livingston indicated that he had taken the oath, everyone screamed, "Long live our great president," and cheered, and they had fireworks that night. They did go to church services at the end. Washington did not say, "So help me God," but he kissed the Bible at the end of taking the oath, a little bit like kings might do in terms of affirming his seriousness towards this mission. And then all the Congress and the president went to St. Paul's Church for ceremonies at the end of the inauguration. But there were fireworks and partying that night. The streets were so crowded, Washington couldn't get home in his carriage. He had to just get out of the carriage and walk home through the crowds to get where he wanted to.
That sounds about how I had to get out of the last inauguration myself. The carriage just wouldn't take me home. I also wanted to say, mention a lot about religion and the tradition there. And, has any of that waned in the past, couple centuries?
Well, I think that most presidents are very inclined to try to connect with the public as much as they can. I think that we have a kind of a paradox, if you will, when we think about the American presidency. On the one hand, we want somebody who's really competent and really effective and, really, really intelligent and capable. But at the same time, we don't want somebody who doesn't understand the lives of ordinary Americans, who isn't sort of like us. And so it's a very difficult needle for a politician to thread, to be both the object of adulation, but also the object of being an ordinary neighbor, community person who would understand how they lived. And I think this was one of the challenges that both Mitt Romney and Barack Obama had in this election cycle, was to try to present themselves as sufficiently connected to ordinary Americans and ordinary American lives so that people could feel that their president could understand them. And so this is an important part of the role that religion can play in the way that presidents talk about themselves and they talk about their situations and how they connect with people. America from the start has been a religious country, but it hasn't had an organized religion controlling the government. And that's a huge difference from countries of the 18th century and the extent to which the secular authorities were connected to the religious authorities of a given society.
The only real emphasis on religion in the Constitution is the specific statement that no religious oath will ever be declared of anyone running for president. Now, obviously, if you ran for president of the United States and said, "I'm an atheist and I want to be president," you would not get elected. But there's in the Constitution, there is this clear statement that no religious preference will be taken. They've seen some of the dangers that religious persecution had caused over the years. But Washington certainly is religious. If you read his first inaugural address, a lot of it is asking for the great builder of the universe to bless the American experiment as he has in the past and carry on in the future.
And of course, if you think about how big the office has become and how much is expected of a modern president and how great the challenges and the risks and the pressures that they face, you could certainly understand why a lot of people would find it really important to try to hope that there's a higher power out there that can help them, because this is an immense job, an immense challenge. Even in the best of times, it's very, very hard.
And as you say that it is very hard still today, and there's new challenges. What would you say George Washington would have done with today's, media and today's politics? I mean, like you said, you didn't think he would run, you didn't think he'd be elected, but it seems like those qualities that you need in a president have changed over time.
Yeah, counterfactual. My challenge is to try to figure out what Washington did. The challenge of what he would do is almost impossible. And really, Washington's prescription was how to make America a great nation, which it was not when he was president. Not how should we act when we are a great nation. So Washington has a different, really a different approach in terms of what he viewed as his responsibilities along that line. I don't know if I answered your question. If not, answer it again. I mean,
I think the nation has changed so much. It's grown. Right. There's more people. There's a larger, diversity.
Washington, he's not an ordinary man. and he's not striving to be an ordinary man. There is a difference. Jimmy Carter said, "I want to be as good as the American people." Well, Washington wanted to be a damn sight better than the American people, because if he were not, we would be in trouble, and I think that's probably true. But Washington comes from a different age, where there is a certain elitism, where people are viewed, some people are superior and ready to rule, and now you have to connect. If you can't connect with the American people, I mean, one of the things that Mitt Romney ran into trouble with was trying that he doesn't understand the 47% of the American people, and that was a real blow to his campaign. But Washington's view basically is power comes from the people. You know, there's the wonderful Lincoln quote, "Government of the people, by the people, for the people." Washington believes in government of the people, for the people, but he wouldn't believe in by the people.
Okay. You know, it's really hard to think about, but, you know, President Obama couldn't have even run for office when George Washington was elected. So, you know, in terms of power of the office now, what do you think he can do in the next 4 years that will continue his legacy?
Well, I think that a lot is going to depend, as the fortunes of his first term depended, on the state of the economy. I think that ultimately it's much easier for a president who is seen as successful to be persuading, to be persuadable not only to the public but also to those members of the other party that might be persuadable. And so you need a situation where there is a measure of very clear success to maximize your effectiveness. I think that the second term normally for most presidents isn't as successful as the first term, because almost immediately people are already talking about who's going to run in the next presidential election. You've already seen a few candidates make the pilgrimage to New Hampshire and to Iowa, thinking about 2016. And so presidents have a very narrow window in a second term, because people almost immediately are thinking, okay, am I going to be on the Hillary Clinton team or the Joe Biden team or some other situation? And so what Obama needs to maximize his effectiveness in a second term is a pretty rapid economic recovery, because even if there is an economic recovery, if it's occurring in year 6 or year 7, there's going to be very little success that he can secure. When we look at the modern partisan divisions in this country, it's very hard for presidents to get much support from the other party. And when the other party controls one chamber of Congress, as of course is the case right now, it's very difficult to get all that far. And you can see that when you look at the recent fights over the fiscal cliff and sequester, that the most Congress can agree to do is give themselves a postponement. I mean, in many ways, you know, when they talked about, you know, Congress waiting until the last minute like students, I think that insults students. No student gets the kind of extensions that members of Congress give themselves.
That's true. So we have about 5 more minutes before we're going to bring our student panelists on board. And I was kind of scrolling through the tweets, and there's been a lot of questions about the Second Amendment, which I think is, you know, something to think about at this time, because when it was written, it seemed, you know, relevant in a completely different way than today. So, you know, if you can tell me what, you know, you think George Washington felt about the Second Amendment then, and, you know, we can talk about maybe Barack Obama's changes, and then we'll wrap this up and move on to the video.
Well, if you go online, you'll find that Second Amendment people will be quoting Washington in terms of support of the Second Amendment, but actually they often add quotes that he did not say. And Washington never said that people need to be armed to protect themselves from the government. And actually, really, the underlying thrust, in my own opinion, of the concern for the Second Amendment and the need for automatic weapons and things like that is because among many people there is a fear that the government is them versus us, not representing us, but they're a threat to us. So we need our guns in order to protect against a government that threatens our freedom. Washington would not see it that way. Washington saw the government as the representative of the people, and He certainly believed in the right to bear arms, as that's clear. But the idea that the government is the enemy of the potential enemy of the people is something that Washington never said, and those who quote him to that effect simply are not accurate.
Okay, that's very interesting. We have about 2 more minutes. Did you want to weigh in?
Well, I think that one of the things to remember is that the Constitution is a work in progress. And when we look just at the words of that document, we see a lot of opportunity for interpretation, whether you're a liberal or a conservative, whether you're a strict constructionist or you believe in an evolving Constitution, you can find something to justify your point of view. And one of the important things to remember is that things in the political environment, even with respect to laws like the amendments in the Bill of Rights, they are not absolute with respect to existing on their own. If you think of the First Amendment and the right to free speech, there are certain things that you can't say. You can't encourage people to, although probably the crowd at Mount Vernon isn't likely to do so, I couldn't encourage you to go out and burn down Mount Vernon across the way here. The truth is that these kinds of incitements to violence are not protected by the First Amendment. And so even though there is a free speech amendment, there are ideas about manner and place and timing that can be instituted as controls, as regulations. And so we're still working through this kind of calculation of what's constitutional and what's not with respect to guns, because, you know, George Washington and the founders didn't really think about assault weapons when they were thinking about the Second Amendment. They didn't really consider the situations like Connecticut. And so one of the things that is really extraordinary about our political system is the ability to work through these questions in light of new evidence, in light of new information. We can amend the Constitution, we can pass laws, we can interpret laws differently depending on circumstances. That's not to say that we need to quote-unquote gut the Second Amendment, but it is to say that we need to think about how we balance these competing rights, because people have a right to be safe as well as they have a right to have a gun. And so we have to come to terms with what is a valuable middle ground for the public and for the government. And our system allows us to work through these issues in a peaceful manner, and that separates us from plenty of other places.
Okay, well, I think we've seen how technology has changed, not only when it comes to the internet, but also when it comes to weapons and everything else. You know, there's pros and cons to it all. We're going to move on to the video and then have our student leaders join us on stage. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
If you were being inaugurated on Monday, what would be the theme of your inaugural speech?
Unity, because the American politics right now isn't unified. We're not thinking of Americans. We're not thinking of each other as Americans. We're thinking each other as two different parties. We're thinking each other as black, white, but we're not thinking as Americans as we should be. And that's causing a lot of problems for ourselves. And frankly, if the next foreseeable future, it's going to be a huge problem because we're not unified. We're divided.
My speech will be about national security, because I feel like America does not feel safe as a country because of the Sandy Hook incident, and before that, the movie theater incident, and before that, 9/11. And I feel like it hurt this country as a whole, and I feel like we don't think that we're as secure as we were. And I know that people have come up with like anti-gun laws to try to alleviate that, but I don't think, as a citizen, I don't think that that would do anything. I think we need something bigger than that.
The theme of my speech, if I were to give one at an inauguration, would be inspiration. It'd be to inspire the people of our country, America, and to bring us more unified as one country. That way we can get rid of all these problems that we're having in debates, so we can have one answer and not keep debating over if we should have gun control laws or not, or if we should have birth control pills or not. And for America, I think it would mean bringing us together as a country and getting rid of the separation that we have with two parties and just being unified as one country.
It would be equality, because with all of the issues with women versus men in the workforce and, you know, of course, the gay rights and so on and so forth, I feel like America is trying to unify everybody, and I feel like that's what we need to focus on, because we can't push forward we're trying to pass things, and it's difficult because there's two really big conflicting opinions, and I feel like we just need to all come together so that we can get all these problems out in these next 4 years and become a better country.
If I was being inaugurated on Monday as President of the United States, my theme would be patience, and I would ask that the American people assist me in my tenure as President, because one man alone cannot fix all the problems that this country has faced. I would do everything in my power to make sure that the President elected after me will succeed in fixing all our economic problems, our environmental problems, and our educational problems.
Okay, and we're back with our student panelists. I have Chris Shepard, and I have Abrar Omish, and I have Brooke Peterson. Thank you so much for joining us. We've looked backwards, forwards, and now I think we're going to go straight to the future. So why don't you guys just tell the audience a little bit about yourself, just maybe what you're studying and why you're joining us today.
Hi everybody, it's good to be here. My name's Chris Shepard. I'm a freshman at St. John's University in Queens, New York, and I'm studying political science and public policy.
Hi everybody, my name is Abrar Omish. I'm a senior at Robinson Secondary. I'm pursuing the IB diploma, and I hope to go to Georgetown School of Foreign Service next year.
Hi, my name is Brooke Peterson. I'm a senior at Centerville High School, and just kind of up here because my growth and development and my interest in government.
Okay, great. Before we kick things off, it sounds like we have a question in the audience. Is that still relevant? Okay, there we go. Hi.
Okay, so I have a question. I know you guys already talked about media, but I know now that presidency is more known and visible, but I was wondering, is it a positive or negative thing? Because I know it can be positive because we get to see the president, and everyone around the world and everyone nationwide, like worldwide, can see the president. But isn't it a negative thing? Because we don't get as much depth because everything is in 2-second segments, and it's 140 characters, and it's not, we're not getting to really meet the president. We are meeting this facade that he makes up to like present to the media. Like, it's not like he's presenting to us anymore. It's like he's presenting to the media. Is media a positive or negative thing?
Sure. Why don't we do a quick yes or no? Has the media made the presidency better or worse? What do you think? We'll start with our professors here. Just if you want to say yes, no, worse, better, whichever you like, and we'll go to the students.
Worse.
I would say worse too, because of the pressure of public opinion and the constant scrutiny under the press doesn't allow for some of the creative leadership that you might have. You know, when they were meeting to write up the Constitution, they agreed to have it in secrecy. Because if they didn't, if the media were noticing everything that was done, people wouldn't be able to change their mind. And I think Washington would have been annoyed significantly if he had to operate under current circumstances.
Okay. I mean, you know, I may have picked the wrong profession here, but what about you guys? Worse or better?
I'd say worse, but there are definitely some good aspects to, you know, the more exposure to media. I mean, it allows him to get his message across to more people. Right now, this is a national broadcast, and so it's just an example of how many people you can speak to and, you know, reach out to and provide your message to. So it's, I think, worse overall, but there's some good aspects too.
I think both. I would definitely argue for both, but unfortunately more worse, and I can talk about that if you're going to ask us to elaborate.
Yeah, I think it's a tough question because like we've said, there's pros and cons to both, but at the end of the day, it has changed the presidency from the beginning, and I think that's kind of how its downfalls.
Okay, and just to put this out there, if you guys have a question, raise your hand and someone will bring you a microphone, or if you don't want to do that, you can certainly still tweet your question to GW Leadership, and we'll try and queue it up. We can't get to everything, so I'll do my best. You know, you guys said something interesting, you know, in terms of the media making it better or worse. I mean, it's going to be sort of a fact of life as we move ahead. And what I find so interesting about your response is the trust that you place either in the government, in media, or in technology. You know, I've worked in the digital space for a long time, and what I find really interesting is the trust that we place in our friends. And what our friends or our parents tell us online or at the living room or in the dining room, we're more likely to trust. So I kind of like to ask you guys, I mean, who do you trust more? Do you trust the government? Do you trust your family? And why? You know, where do you place that in terms of decision making and how this would affect, you know, this next term?
Well, I think it depends. I mean, if you're talking about a very complicated issue like, you know, Iran trying to, get nuclear weapons, I definitely wouldn't trust my 22-year-old brother. You know, I wouldn't trust him on something like that. But I think that it goes both ways. There are some, I think, media outlets that, you know, have a better track record for being trustworthy and honest. And so, you know, I watch a lot of, you know, C-SPAN and things that are, you know, not necessarily biased. And so when it comes to complicated issues like that, you know, for our nation and for our people, I go to, you know, sources like that, the Mount Vernon, you know. So, yeah.
That's great.
I think it's a challenge in two different ways. The first being so much media out there. It's what do you choose? What do you know is trustworthy? So I think a diversity of a variety of sources is really important. They teach us that in school. I know that, I mean, recently, Madam Secretary Hillary Clinton said that Al Jazeera is one of the most credible sources. So just trying to get a diverse a variation of the sources that you are seeing, especially on a biased topic, you know, trying to look at different points of view. But the other problem that media poses is that because of people's reliance on it for the message and everything, it puts a lot of pressure on politicians and on people who are supposed to speak to us from a genuine perspective in terms of accountability, in terms of, should I say this to please the voters so I can win again, or am I going to say this so that, which is the truth of the situation? So that's where it's become a challenge, I think, trusting the media source and how they're interpreting the issue, and trusting the people who are speaking through the media anyway.
Okay.
So.
I think you trust what you know. My family, definitely the way you're raised, how you're influenced, it's how you've been grown, that's what you trust in. And I think it changes over time as you develop your own views and your own decisions. But also, like what we were talking about before with the government, with the media, as we spoke about, things can be misquoted, like they can be taken through different perspectives, and that's where trust issue comes into play. You can't always believe what you read as they tell you not everything on the internet is true, and that's how we're told most of our information from the government now is through internet, through the media, and it's become a challenge to trust them through those issues.
The other problem is the ease with which one person can have so much influence. That's, yeah, I mean, my family's been personally affected by this in so many regards in terms of what people can post and then what people read and what people truly believe, which can be some lunatic writing about whatever they feel that has no credibility whatsoever.
So we still need the fourth estate in some ways to balance all those people out there.
One of the challenges, too, is the more extreme voices are the voices. If you want to get on television, you take a more extreme position and you may get a hearing. If you're thoughtful, middle of the road, it's much harder to do. It doesn't sell as well. So, you know, certainly as would-be historians or leaders, if nothing else, be skeptical. You know, as you listened to Lance Armstrong a few months ago, be skeptical. And you do, you know, that's just a good rule of thumb in terms of assessing information, because people can sound pretty persuasive until you examine the story in a little more detail.
Sure. And if I can raise one more thing.
Sure. I wanted to get to one more question, so go ahead.
Okay. The media is biased towards equality often, or towards a balanced perspective, although sometimes it's a clear-cut issue. You know, we're facing that with gun control, just briefly to mention. A lot of people say the American populace is against guns, while, you know, we have, in the media, we see it as a balanced issue, something that the country's divided on, things like that. So I think because people are realizing that the media can be biased, there's also now becoming the problem of bias towards equality when an issue might be very clear-cut.
So. Okay. Really a quick poll. If you heard from President Obama on Facebook, would you trust him more than if you saw him on CNN, or if you saw, or less? For those who would trust him more on Facebook, raise your hand. And if you saw him on CNN, would you trust him more? Okay, so interesting. I'm just curious about the messaging and the medium here. I know we have another question in the audience, so I just want to hear from them. Yeah?
Yeah, hi, I'm from Woodson High School right here in Fairfax, Virginia. President Obama said in his 2009 inauguration address that we the people have remained faithful to the ideas of our forebears and true to the founding documents. How much does this apply, like when you guys were talking about gun control and how the Constitution can be interpreted, how much does that quote right there apply to today and how we do things in our government today?
Well, I would, if I could start on this one, I would say that it's an evolutionary process. What the Constitution means, what we understand our political system to be about. Once upon a time, we had slavery. Once upon a time, we had senators who were elected by state legislatures rather than voters. I mean, we have a process here that is evolutionary, not revolutionary. And that's an important thing to appreciate as we go through these years. And so, in many ways, the Constitution is a roadmap more than a destination, I think. And so it gives us a place to go, a vision of who we might be as a people. And we're not there yet. We weren't there in 1865, we weren't there in 1805. I would argue we're not there yet because there's still a lot of things to work through in terms of figuring out how to make a society that more people can feel happy about, that more people can feel more satisfied with. And maybe that's an impossible task. Washington was the only one with the perfect score in the Electoral College, and that's not going to change anytime soon, I think. But to the extent that we can, reduce the frustrations and anger that so many people feel in our political system, we should think about how we can do that. And that would be a challenge for us, a challenge for you, and a challenge going forward.
I mean, much of the Constitution is deliberately ambiguous because when you're seeking to get approval, if you fudge things, we can all say who wants a healthy and happy America. We all agree. But if we start to say, well, what about taking away assault weapons, then you begin to break down. The Constitution's deliberately vague. And Washington, as president, there was a major issue. Should he sign a bank bill? And Thomas Jefferson wrote a wonderfully eloquent statement. It doesn't say in the Constitution we can do it. If we do it, we open up a Pandora's box, and then the government will be able to do anything. Alexander Hamilton picked up his pen and said there are implied powers within the Constitution to promote the general welfare, and a bank is one of them. Washington took the broad interpretation of the Constitution, signed the bank bill. I think if he had not done that, whatever the Tea Party position is, if you take a stultifyingly narrow view of the Constitution, you simply, it can't work from 1787, 88 until 2013. There has to be a certain amount of flexibility, and that's one reason why we have our executive branch and our judicial branch to interpret what was within the broad limits of the Constitution. Constitution is crucial, but it's not an absolute straitjacket because it often doesn't tell you what to do about assault weapons or pornography or child labor or things along that line. It's just not in there.
So it sounds like you guys have a lot of work to do in terms of reinventing the Constitution over the next, 100 years. We have only a couple minutes left, and I really wanted to hear from this panel, what is your hope for the second term? That's why we're here today, to celebrate the inauguration and talk about it, and I know I've learned a lot, so I hope you guys have too. Brooke, maybe you can tell us in a few words, what you hope this second term will mean for Obama or for yourself and your generation.
Well, I think the main thing I always think about is common ground. It's been a recent issue in our Congress, and it's come up in discussions a lot lately, and just how we need to come back, we need to collect, and almost need to go back to the way George Washington did it, where he wanted this peaceful transition of power, and it needs to fall back as we are one nation, and this is our president, and this is what we are set for the next 4 years.
I completely agree. I think that there are three main things that we need to look at moving forward. Number one is minimizing partisanship. I think everyone can agree on that one. The congressional approval rating is 14 to 17%. We're talking about a government by the people. There's clearly a problem there. And the other thing is in terms of reviving a morality in the people. I think when Washington gave his speech, he referred to God a lot and everything. And I'm not saying it necessarily has to be religious. We are very secular, and we protect the rights of people who choose to have faith and people who choose not to. But I think that is part of the issue with accountability, the issue with bias in the media, all of that. Really having morality in each individual in terms of how they lead their life. And that way they'll only care about the cause, serving the people the way it's supposed to happen, and not how they come out in terms of the public eye.
So more public servants.
No, seriously. And the last point is bringing back the idea that the United States is a land of opportunity, and bringing back the meritocracy that's involved with that. I mean, prices in terms of college and everything, we're facing that. Things like healthcare, things that are basic rights that everybody should have, that the president has done a great job on, to continue moving towards those types of things, so everyone has a true equal opportunity in this country. So that's
okay.
I think Brooke and Abrar both made great points, and I'd like to just piggyback off what they said about bipartisanship. You know, nowadays our politics has become so polarized and divisive, and going forward, you know, not just in the next 4 years, but by the time, you know, we're making our contribution to help people, I'd like to see a government more together. And I think a good quote for this was in Barack Obama's first inaugural speech. And he says, "The question we ask today is not whether our government is too big or too small, but whether it works." And you know, whether it helps families find jobs at a decent wage, whether they can find health care that they can afford, you know, retirement that's dignified. And where the answer is yes, we intend to move forward. And where the answer is no, you know, programs will end. And so I think that as long as we as a people can unite around that, you know, that common theme, that common goal, just to make people's lives better, despite our partisan differences, I think that it'll be a more together America. And that's what I want to see. And in case you haven't noticed, if the three of us 20 years from now are doing what we plan to do, you know, we're on the right track.
That's good. Yeah, I like this idea of unity. I hope we can move ahead with that. Really quick for you three before I get some final words from our professors. A tweet from Zara Lynn, a yes or no, and this is a big one, so you don't answer how you feel. Would you guys ever want to be president?
Absolutely.
Want to be.
Absolutely.
All right, so the guy he didn't even hesitate. All right, ladies, what do you think?
I'm gonna say no. That's not the position of power I want to hold. That's not saying I wouldn't ever want to be a part of our government or hold a position, but I just don't see myself putting myself in the position of presidency.
I think I'm going to answer that in a similar way that George Washington approached it. I mean, it's something, public service is definitely my passion. That's what I think. I've been given so much that that's what I need to do with my life, is give back. But I think it's an immense responsibility that we don't, I mean, you're serving the entire nation, and it's a huge responsibility that he saw with anxiety. I mean, he came in his first sentence, I'm approaching this with great anxieties. This is a huge responsibility that I'm in no place to say that right now. I don't know what I'm going to be. I don't know what the situation of the country is going to be.
Of course. I know, it's a big one. Sorry. You know,
no.
You still probably, you know, you can go home for the weekend and think about it. But
just really quickly, Jen, the thing that unites the three of us up here on the stage is that we all want to help people. And despite what we're doing 20 or 30 years from now, despite what the titles in front of our names are, we will be helping people. And that's the important thing.
Yeah, I think so. We're almost out of time, so I don't want to prompt any more discussion, but I want to thank everyone for coming and for everyone who tweeted and participated. It's been a really lovely discussion, and I feel more informed, and I feel really hopeful for the next 4 years and probably the next 40. So thanks again.
Oh my God. Thank you.